computer is picking up a strange signal. Here, sir, you better take a look at it.
Hi, and welcome to Sci-Fi Snacks. I'm Liz J. Bradley, a science fiction author and poet who adores short fiction and snacks. Each episode of Sci-Fi Snacks is a short and sweet, or salty, discussion of what I loved, what I learned, and what I snacked on while reading new-to-me short science fiction. As always, links to the short stories are in the show notes, so if you haven't read this week's story, head on over, pick up your favorite snack, and then join me as we discuss this week's story. Hello and welcome back to Sci-Fi Snacks. This is episode 19, where we are going to be talking about the really fun and interesting story called One Night in Television City. The journey to this story was a little interesting. I'm finding that every once in a while I'll pick out a story and read it and then realize, no, this is not one for the podcast for whatever reason. Either I just don't have enough to say about it, or it's a story that doesn't really resonate with me. In the case of this week, I am a little sensitive. I'll say that. I'm not really big into horror or kind of slasher gore type things, and I stumbled on a series of stories that I had thought were like gothic punk. That was what I had them labeled as in my spreadsheet. And it turns out they were a little more slasher, splatter punk. And if you know anything about the subgenre, unlike me, splatterpunk it's a lot. It is really graphic. It is really violent in ways that I'm just not comfortable with. So I read the story, and the whole time I was thinking, maybe it'll get better. Maybe it'll be something that will turn around. Maybe the women in the story will be treated like humans and not props. And unfortunately, that was not the case. So I'm not going to name that story because the point of the podcast isn't to come on here and talk about things that I didn't like. It's here to uplift other science fiction writers and their stories and the things that I get really excited about and what I learned from that. So I kept reading and I found another punk subgenre. If you can believe it, I found one that I had not heard of to this point, biopunk. So I went out in search of a biopunk story. Now, biopunk is a mashup of biology and punk. So it's a subgenre in science fiction that focuses on the biotechnology. So it's like cyberpunk. And as we continue this series, you'll see a lot of these subgenres are referential. So this is like cyberpunk, but focusing on biotechnology instead of the more mechanical cyber technology and things like that. So it's almost like a mashup of the two. So if cyberpunk deals with more of the internet and hardware, think of biopunk as wetware. So we are implanting chips. We're doing weird things to our bodies with body modification. A lot of this stuff was kind of really revolutionary back in the early days. Now I think we're so much more open as a society to body modifications, even just like in the last couple of decades. From when I was growing up, it used to be something like visible tattoos. If you wanted a professional job, like forget it. If you had a tattoo that people could see, like you would never work in a corporate place. Now all you have to do is go to like any tech company and like it's almost weird if you don't have tattoos or fun colored hair or some sort of, piercings or modifications and things like that. So I think biopunk is a really cool genre to explore, especially in an older piece. So today's story, One Night in Television City, was actually published back in 96, so 1996, in a book called Biopunk, which was a group of short stories all written by Paul DeFilippio. Paul D. Filippo is the author of hundreds of short stories, some of which have been collected in these widely praised collections: the Steampunk Trilogy, Ribofunk, Fractal Paisleys, Lost Pages, Little Doors, Strange Trades, Babylon Sisters, and his multiple award-nominated novella, A Year in the Linear City. Another earlier collection, Destroy All Brains, was published by Pirate Writings, but is quite rare because of the extremely short print run. If you see one, buy it. Paul lives in Providence, Rhode Island. So Paul coined the phrase ribofunk, which is the name of this collection of short stories, by fusing the word ribosome from cellular biology with funk, like rock and roll, funky music. So he had said, in the world of ribofunk, biology is a cutting-edge science where the protein police patrol for renegade gene splicers and part human sea creatures live in Lake Superior dealing with toxic spills. So I thought that was kind of cool. And this is really a great collection of short stories, so you should definitely check it out. And if you like this story this week, he's got hundreds more, which I think is one of my favorite things about reading short science fiction. Is it's such a great way to find new authors. I don't know about you, but my TBR, my to be read pile, is so huge. In fact, I don't usually even keep a pile anymore. I had a shelf for a while. I was like, oh, this is the TBR shelf. And then it became 2 shelves. And now it's a whole bookcase. And now I'm just like, okay, I let my husband organize all of the books in the house. And when I'm feeling like I want to pick out something, I just go browsing. Because time is limited and we can't read all of the books in the world. And I think it's the biggest tragedy. But it can feel like a big commitment sometimes to pick up a new author that you know nothing about, because you're going to be investing a lot of time and headspace and emotional bandwidth as you go along that journey. And a short story, if they write short stories, which thankfully a lot of science fiction and fantasy authors do, they get their start still, even though it's not, there is no traditional path to science fiction writing, but there's so many of us who are still writing short fiction that it's such an excellent introduction to someone. And if you vibe with their writing, then you know that when you jump into their novels, you're not wasting your time, but you're going to have the experience that you want to for what you go to books for. So I thought that was great. And I think it works the opposite way too. I read this other short story that we're not talking about this week, and I realized, oh, that's a whole subgenre that I can just avoid. I only had to commit to a short story to realize that is not my cup of tea. I didn't have to try and commit to a book. And you can DNF a book. So do not finish, did not finish, whatever, we shorten it to DNF. You can DNF a book for literally any reason. I do it all the time when I'm just not vibing and whatever, but I have a hard time with it and I feel guilty, and maybe it's the people pleaser in me that I'm like, oh, I started it, I should finish, but it's a lot easier with a short story. I did almost DNF the short story and then I was like, no, it's going to get better, and it did not. But that's neither here nor there, because I discovered One Night in Television City and had a wonderful night reading that and snacking on some hot Cheetos and Liquid Death cherry flavored water. Now, when I thought of the punk theme for this season, I immediately was like, what are snacks that say punk to me? And Andy Cap hot fries. I couldn't find that specific brand for this episode, but I did find the Cheetos brand hot fries. And then I also tried the Cheetos, just hot Cheetos. But for me, I don't know what it is. It's just that feels punk. And then for a drink, Liquid Death is the perfect example of a punk drink, where I don't know if you know the backstory. It's fascinating. It was punk rock bands. They had members who were on stage and they just felt like, having a crinkly water bottle felt really not punk. But they couldn't drink alcohol for one reason or another. One, maybe like, they were sober, or it's just like you need to be able to focus to play the music. Like, it's totally cool if you have a beer out in the audience and you're smashing that down while you listen. You don't have to focus on playing the music and getting all the notes right and things like that. So Liquid Death was born, where it started out, it was just water in these cool looking cans so that they could drink water on stage and not have it look silly. And so I always thought that was a fun kind of little backstory. And I did not know that Liquid Death had expanded beyond just like flat water and sparkling water without a flavor. And so I went and I picked out, I think I had the choice between like blueberry and something else and cherry. And I love cherry sparkling water. I know the whole LaCroix, whatever you want to call it, like, oh, it's like it sniffed a strawberry once and had a memory. It tastes like the memory of it, or it tastes like television static. I love them. I unabashedly love sparkling water that is unsweetened. And Liquid Death is not. That's what I thought I was getting, but they have sweetener in there. And so that was an experience, and we'll get back to that when we get to the end of this. But we have spent enough time chatting about my snack preferences. Let's dive into what happened on this one night in Television City. Okay, so the story starts with a paragraph that was actually kind of confusing, and we'll come back around to this, but in the opening paragraph, essentially, we have a main character talking to someone, you're not quite sure who, and posing the question of, how do I get down? I have climbed up here to the top of a building, and okay, yeah, I climbed up, but how do I get down? And it's very confusing, and you're just like, I'm not quite sure what's going on. But then we jump backwards in time. So we have this hooky first paragraph, and then we're going to jump back in time and find out how our main character got to the top of a building that he can't get down off of. We start out this night in Television City going to a Meta Milk bar where he gets this thing called a Needle Strength 9 drink. And immediately we are hit with all sorts of kind of jargon and vocabulary, and just keep that kind of in the back of your mind as we talk through what actually happened in this story, that it took me a couple of reads to really figure out what was happening. So he's at this bar, and then his friend shows up, and they're kind of talking shit back and forth. And this friend, our main character, finds out that this friend has started he's got loose lips. So he's been talking about how our main character was kind of bragging that he was with this girl. And we find out pretty quickly that the main character may have overstated some things, or his friend misunderstood. We're not quite sure. I think this is kind of a case of everybody's exaggerating, like a game of telephone. So he says, he thinks this girl's pretty and she's hot and he'd like to hang out with her. And the friend takes it as, ooh, they're hanging out. And then the friend goes and tells everybody he's macking it with this girl, and isn't he so cool, and I'm so cool by association. And it just blows up into this thing. And we find out that our main character is not happy about this, because the main character says, I never said that. Also, this girl, her name is Charlotte. I think they call her Charlie throughout most of it, but her name is Charlotte, is actually dating the head member of this gang called the Body Artists. And the Body Artists are these crazy body modification, like, think of everything you can do to make yourself strong and buff and like the worst people to piss off. That's the Body Artists. And the head of the Body Artists, his name is Turbo. And Turbo is actually dating Charlotte. So our main character starts to freak out. And he's like, we got to get out of here. Like, the Body Artists hang around here. If they've heard what you're talking, this is not going to end well. So there's this sequence where he and his friend kind of run around town, and we get all of this kind of backstory, and we get the flavor of the world, which is really cool. And they go to another bar. They have a bunch of this stuff called cheer beer, which is like beer that's not depressing. It's beer that makes you happy. So I thought that was a fun little detail. And then what happens? The body artists show up at this bar. Dun, dun, dun. Because of course they do. Because we knew this is where the story was going, right? So the body artists show up and Turbo does this thing. It's like this brilliant rhetoric of he catches our main character in the lies and he makes him say things that he doesn't really mean, like almost like insults Charlotte because it's like, oh no, like I wouldn't date her. Well, why wouldn't you date her? Isn't she good enough? Oh yeah, she's awesome. Like, oh, so you think she's awesome? And like, is that why you're saying that you're with her? And all of this stuff. And he just gets so tripped up. And it's this brilliant little wordplay. And it's funny because I'm thinking right now, I'm like, it's like the scene in Mean Girls where Regina George is just like, oh, so you agree, you're pretty. And it's like, oh, I did say that, but maybe I shouldn't have. So we think that it's going to be really bad for our main character, but then Turbo throws another twist. And this twist is that Turbo says, well, there is a different solution. Like, we could throw you off the top of a bridge, or you could kind of go through initiation and become a body artist too. And their main character is just like, what? This is the best deal ever. Like, he's not a part of any of the gangs. And we get like kind of the background on all of the different body modification gangs and all of these like cool groups that he is clearly an outsider in. And so the thought of being accepted into this group is thrilling to him. And he's like, yes, he doesn't even think about it. And so he goes with the body artists and they all go underground to their lair. There's this big net and they're like jumping around and they give him, they charge him up is how they put it. And so basically they kind of pump him full of some chemicals or something that makes him stronger and faster. And all of these things like the body artists, because you literally can't get to their lair without the extra strength or the ability to jump as far and things like that. So they charge him up and then Turbo is like, we're going to climb a building. And he's like, awesome, let's do it. And so they climb this really, really tall building. And then about halfway, 3/4 of the way up, our main character starts to feel things wearing off. And you can tell Turbo planned it all along. He knew. So he's like, I don't have to throw you off a bridge if you fall off a building. So it was a setup. The whole thing was a setup. Eventually, our main character does get to the top of the building, though. He jumps. He's really heroic. You have to read it. And then he gets to the top and Turbo goes away and he's kind of pissed off. But he calls the police on him because he's not supposed to be up there. Like, it's super illegal. And then we get to the last paragraph and you realize it's the first. It's the first paragraph. So it is this loop of this was how we got to this place. Our main character is talking to the cops who want to arrest him and everything because they're like, how did you get up here? You're not supposed to be. And he's like, the question isn't how I got up here. It's how am I getting down? And that's the story. So the biggest thing that I really loved about this is it's a convention or a trope that happens in a lot of stories, but when it's done really well, it's my favorite thing. And it's where you loop the story. So the beginning is the end and the end is the beginning. And it's this circle because what it does, and maybe this is just me, but what it does to me every single time I read a story like this, I'm like halfway through the story again because I'm like, oh, this is the thing. And I go back and I read the beginning. And then usually it's such a good story that I just keep reading. And it's so clever on the author's part, I think, because it gets people to not just read your story and be like, oh, that was a nice little story, and then they move on with their life. No, they're going back. They're rereading it. They're reading it with new eyes and reading it with this new layer of meaning because they've read the story. And it makes me think about how, as a writer, we know so much about our stories and we read them so many times in the process of writing. Like no one, well, I hate absolutes, but no one writes a story perfectly the first time. You're always going to edit. You're always going to go through, change things, evolve things. If you're maybe writing it in your brain, stories don't come fully formed. There's so much work and time spent creating these stories, and then people can read them so fast. Like, I feel bad sometimes about how fast I can read a book that someone is like, yeah, that was 5 years of my life, or that was a decade, or even a year. And I consume it in a day and a half, a weekend. And I'm like, great, can I have more? It feels rude now as a writer, and I mean that in the best way, that the time it takes to consume a story is exponentially shorter. I don't know if you can say it that way, but like way, way shorter than the time it takes to actually birth the creation. And that's that way for like a lot of art. I mean, think about like physical studio art. How many people just scroll through Instagram and it's like, oh, that's cool. And it's like it took 6 months for that painter to create that painting, and you look at it for 2 seconds. Like, yeah, it feels rude. It also feels like one of the reasons that a lot of people are drawn towards creation and get frustrated with it is because it is so hidden how long it takes to create anything, and to create anything worthwhile. As a sidebar, that's one of the reasons that AI writing and AI art sucks, because it takes no time. There is no struggle. There is no story. It's press a button, get a product. And that's what it is. It's a product. It's not art. So we'll move on. But we'll talk about AI some other time. But that's one of the reasons that it sucks so bad, in my opinion. But what this story did really well was it got me to reread it and to spend more time with it. And another reason that I had to spend more time with this story than, say, any other story that maybe time loops or any other story that I've read for this season so far is just the way the prose was written. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book A Clockwork Orange. I can't speak to the whole of the book because I never finished it, because I could never get into it. It's one of those books that you start reading it and you're like, wait, what am I reading? Very similar to many people's experiences trying to read something like Shakespeare, where you read it and you're like, I know all these words, but what did I just say? Because I don't want to say dialect, because it's not really a dialect. It was almost like a whole new way of speaking and communicating, and like an evolution of language, where it was almost like a foreign language in terms of certain words meant certain things and you could figure it out from context clues, but it was so dense. It was so complete in terms of the words on the page being almost a barrier to the story. And I'm a huge Shakespeare fan. Love it. Think it's awesome. Totally understand that like it was the pop culture of its day. And half of the fun for me with Shakespeare is that decoding of figuring out what are they actually trying to say. And without something like where it has a translation in No Fear Shakespeare, I want to read it and I want to look and I want to do the mental work to figure out, okay, what does this mean? It doesn't mean I never use any sort of translation stuff, because a lot of the time with something like Shakespeare, there's context that's missing historically for me to understand. But for something like this, it was the same sort of experience where I was like, okay, now that I've read it once and I have this overview of the story, I know like the plot. Now I want to dive in and figure out like, what are all these details? Like, what are all of the things on a line level saying? It really made me pay attention to the actual words on a page. And I love when a story can do that, because it just pulls me in and it's like a workout for my brain. And it's just like a physical workout. It can hurt while you're doing it, but it's so satisfying to decode something and be like, wow, that was really cool. I understood that. I can see this extra layer of world building you've put into this story that wasn't necessarily necessary for me to understand kind of the broad strokes of the plot, but it just adds such depth to the world when they're out, especially that sequence where they're between bars and they're running around and trying to avoid the body artists for the first time. There's so much world building there that I would be surprised if there weren't more stories in this style from this author. So if you like weird prose that makes your brain work out, definitely check this story out. Now, what I learned from this story was I really continued to think about things like dialects, because the general rule of thumb advice that you get a lot of the time when you've got dialects is don't put a dialect on a page. If you've got a Southern character, don't write out phonetically kind of what it sounds like. And my thought about all of this is that I think you need to lean all the way in or lean all the way out. And it's that wishy-washy middle where it doesn't really hit. And you're just you didn't commit to the bit. And I think that this is a story that committed 1,000% to the bit of this future language. It's not a story where it's just we're going to throw in one piece of jargon every chapter or everything, or it could be mistaken for modern day of whenever the author wrote it, except for a couple weird words. No, this was a complete immersion in this biopunk world that was our own, but also so different from our own. So I thought that was really cool, and that got me thinking about how I use language in my own work. Now, I don't think I'm going to go out and write something this intense. I don't really have a desire to write that way, but I do think I'm going to think about this when I'm world building and thinking about how I use language and how people talk and how that kind of informs the story. That brings me to the second point that I wrote down here, is that this story on its face was pretty simple. It had a classic story arc. Guy walks into a bar, guy talks shit about things, gets in trouble by the local gang, is told, hey, join us, and then, they trick him and set him up, and we find him at the end in a perilous place. It's not a complicated story on a plot level, which could be boring, but this story wasn't boring. And I think what makes this story special is the treatment of it. It was all of this really cool world building and the aesthetics and the body artists, the way they described their bodies was just so cool. They had modifications that made them all giraffe printed, and they were huge, Adonises, and their bodies looked like they were carved from stone, and just all of these really interesting details that made you want to keep reading. And so I think that there's this, I've talked about it on the podcast before, where there's only, there's a saying that there's only two stories in the world, and it's you go on a journey or a stranger comes to town. And this is kind of that journey story, but it wasn't, there's only so many stories we can write. It's all about how you write it. Which is why there are a lot of young writers who get really worried about what if somebody steals my idea? And it comes down to the fact that nobody is going to write it like you. We can all get the same writing prompt and we will all write different stories. And you could take this story structure, a guy in a bar talking with his friend, says something about a girl, rumors spread, the gang comes and gets him, they set him up, and you could write that 70 million ways, depending on what you know and your life experience and all of that kind of thing. And that's how you write what you know. Because I may not know body modification, bar, cyber, biopunk type stuff, but I could write my own version of it based on things in my life experience. So we're going to tie this back to the snack that was not chosen for this story, but rather for kind of its punk vibes. And the way it ties back for me is with the hot fries. So at first, I took a bite of everything and I took a sip of this liquid death cherry and I was like, ugh, I hate all of it. I did not finish the liquid death. I gave it to my kids. I was like, you guys have it. They'll drink anything. They were really excited about it, actually. But the hot fries, man, they were a lot. But I kept going back. It feels like this story. The language was a lot. It was, at first, you're bumping your head up against it and you're like, oh gosh, I have to like think really hard and it's too much. And the hot fries, they were too hot. It was a lot. But then you get used to it and you're like, they're really crunchy and they're good and I kind of like the texture. And all of a sudden the bag is empty. So yeah, that's my tie back to our Cheetos hot fries. All right, just a reminder, our last episode of the season, we will be talking about the post-cyberpunk novel Snow Crash. If you did not catch me talking about that last episode, make sure you find yourself a copy and read it. That episode, I don't know, maybe we'll have to do a two-parter, but this is a chunky book. I posted my unbagging, because it came in a bag, not a box, of the book, and it's big. It's going to be a lot. I'm glad I've given myself time to read it. But make sure you give yourself some time if you want to know. Or you can just spark note it. No shame in that game either. I'm not your teacher. This is for fun. So I hope you have a wonderful week. Next week's story is linked in the show notes as well. It's called The Life Cycle of a Cyber Bar. And I can't wait to chat with you more about it. Have a great week and keep on snacking.